So before I started, I just wanted to get a quick show of hands. Who here works at a football club that has a data analytics department? So quite a few. Now keep your hand up if that department has existed for more than 5 years. Yeah, as I expected, much fewer. So one thing we talk a lot about at these conferences is how to actually do analysis, how do we look at football in general using data, but I think we talk less about how to build a department, and a lot of us, that's our main job, because we're coming into a club that doesn't have a pre-established department. You're the first analytics hire, the second analytics hire, and I think building out that department is just as important as the actual analysis you do. And so building a department, I think the first question you have to ask is, why are we doing this? Presumably the sporting director or ownership will have asked this question, but as the person who's in charge of building out the department, you really have to answer this yourself as well and say, what is my goal within this club? What do I want to accomplish with this department? And the first answer that you'll often hear is win more games. I don't think this is actually a great guiding principle, because it's not really clear, A, what games, how we're going to influence winning those games, and different people in the club have different ideas of what games they actually want to focus on. So I have one math slide, I apologize. But this I want to bring in, this is an equation that we see in finance or economics a lot, which looks at how much you discount something. So this is often used to look at how much we value an asset today versus in the future. So let's say, for example, I offer you £100 today or £100 1 year from now. So each person would have a different answer as to how much they would value getting that today versus a year from now. So if you have a discount factor of 1, it means you value that £100 the same today as you would a year from now. If you have one close to 0, it means you'd much rather have it today. And one thing that's very rare, but you could have hypothetically, is a discount factor of greater than 1, which means you'd rather me give you £100 in a year than today. And the way this applies to football is I think different people in a club value points or value results differently based on what their role is. So what I have here is I've got a list of quotes from decision makers, and these are all real quotes from decision makers at our club, and I'm going to try and apply a discount factor to them. So the first, this is one I'm sure you've heard from a head coach at any club, which is, we're concentrated on us, only us in the next game. I mean, it's a classic coach line to say we're only thinking about the next game. And so this would imply a discount factor of 0, which is saying that we only care about the next game, we don't care about points in the future. Now, I don't think a head coach actually thinks like this, but it's the way they talk, and because they're evaluated so much on how they do in the next 2-3 games, their job is much less secure than other people at a club. Their main focus is always going to be the immediate future and the games that are immediately coming up. If we look at the sporting director, so again, here's a quote from our sporting director, which is, we're working on the structure, process, setting goals for what we want to accomplish in the years to come. Now, I still think if you ask the head coach or ask the sporting director which game is most important, they would say the next one. But they have to have a longer term view. They have to think about how the club's going to look in a year's time. So I think their discount factor would be closer to 1, but still less than 1 because they value the next game as the most important. Now, at Inter Miami at least, I would say the next biggest decision maker on the sporting side would be our academy director. And again, this is a quote about his goal of what he's trying to accomplish at the academy, which is, we want to put a man on the moon, we want to put homegrown players in the first team roster. So this is not something that's going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen. We have 3 games left of the season. I doubt we're going to give many minutes to any academy graduates in the next 3 games. So his discount factor would actually be greater than 1. He would care more about how the team does a year from now, 2 years from now, than he would about our result coming up in 2 weeks. So because you have all these different people at the club who have different goals, I think in building data department, it's really important to empower people to use data and focus on processes rather than immediate results. Because just saying, I want to help our club win more games, doesn't really answer the question of which games and which person you're supporting at the club. So I've tried to focus on building a department kind of following our Inter Miami values. So these are values that are set across the club: ambition, excellence, and collaboration. And I've tried to kind of work this into how I've built the department at Inter Miami. And the first question that I asked was, how do I build the best data department for my club? So I'm going to call out a couple other clubs that are in the audience and go through how you build a different data department that's actually tailored to the specifics of your club. So I have up here Liverpool, Inter Miami, Atletico Mineiro, who are the Brazilian Serie A champions. I was just talking to one of their data analysts earlier who said they're unlikely to repeat, but current Serie A champions in Brazil, and Dulwich Hamlet, who are my favorite non-league team. So the first thing that you'd look at is what are the restrictions on the club. I can see Ian laughing at me saying Liverpool has a virtually unlimited transfer budget, but from my perspective, Liverpool has a virtually unlimited transfer budget. At Inter Miami, we're limited by the MLS salary cap. Mineiro can pay very high salaries and wages, so they would be on average higher than what we could pay at Inter Miami. And then at Dulwich Hamlet, you have only semi-pro contracts. So again, I think it's important just to think about who are the types of players that we're able to attract. And then I would look at the types of data that are available. So at Liverpool and at Inter Miami, we have almost identical data availability in terms of we have a tracking data deal with the league, and we have multiple event data options. At Mineiro, they have the same event data options, but there's no league tracking deal, so that will lead to a slightly different department because you won't have that same data access. If you're at a club like Dulwich Hamlet, you're going to have very limited event data options, and you're probably going to be relying on collecting data yourself. The next thing I'd look at is the actual types of players that are coming. So at Liverpool, I looked at, I think in the last 5 years, all the players have come from top European leagues, and there's 1 or 2 from Brazil. At Inter Miami, in the last transfer window, we signed players from Egypt, Colombia, Turkey, Norway. So we really have a broad base of where we bring players in from. At Mineiro, the entire squad is South American, but there are a lot of players who have played in Europe before. Where at Dulwich Hamlet, you're looking at all English players and mostly London-based. So based on these factors, and again, this is just 3 things I went through, but you could look at a variety of other factors, you get very different analytics departments. So if you look at how Liverpool have built theirs, they've focused on hiring the best data science talent, the best modeling talent, because for Liverpool, the difference between a 90th percentile player and an 80th percentile player could be the difference between winning the title and not winning the title. The focus has been on, again, valuing players and the recruitment side. At Inter Miami, it's just me, which again has to do with the budget that we have as a club, the age of the club, as we're only 3 years old. But we focused a lot on breadth. So for us, the difference between an 80th and a 90th percentile player is probably not as big. We'd be happy if we could get an 80th or a 90th percentile player at any position. But we need to make sure that we are looking as broadly as possible because we're limited by the salary cap, we're limited by the types of players we can bring in. We have domestic player rules, so anyone who has an American passport, we have an advantage. So for us, we've really focused on, okay, how wide can we look, make sure that we're looking across the entire world to bring in talent. At Mineiro, again, they have a slightly more limited group of players because they're all South American players at the moment, and they've built a department with multiple people and focused exclusively on recruitment because they don't have, or I think almost exclusively on recruitment because they don't have a league-wide tracking deal. At Dulwich Hamlet, you'd probably have to have a student or someone who'd be willing to do it on a volunteer basis. So I think this shows it's not necessarily just, okay, big clubs should do this, small clubs should do this. The type of department you build has to be relative to the strengths and weaknesses, the data availability, the types of players that you're bringing in. And I think that's the first step, is you really have to look at how do I build the best data department for my team. I think the next thing you want to look at is where you can take up space within the club. So the most important thing is first team results. So working backwards from first team results, we can look at how these results actually come about, which is the players. So at the start, you have the first team players, and then we have a player pathway from the academy through to the second team to the first team. So if we want to improve results, the easiest way is to improve the players. And there's 2 ways we can do that. We can look at the recruitment team. So we bring in players, that's through the sporting director, recruitment director, bring in players to the first and second teams. And then the other way we can bring in players is by improving our academy players. So the players that are already at the club, and we can do that through the academy director and the coaches. So that's the first way that we can improve first team results. The second way is through the coaching staffs. So that's both first team and second team, performance analysts, video analysts. And I have 2 arrows here, one directly from the first team technical staff to the first team players by the coaches actually making the players better, teaching them new skills, helping them improve, and then also from the coaching staff to results, because if we're better prepared for an upcoming opponent, we'll better be able to play that game, be prepared for that game, without necessarily directly improving the players that we have at the club. And the final way that I think you can improve first team results is through the performance staff. So this is sports science, fitness, medical, nutrition, and this will improve players directly, again, all throughout the pathway, so academy, second team, first team, and if you have more prepared players, you're also going to have improved results. So I think analytics can target all of these departments at a club. At Inter Miami, I focused mostly on the first team technical staff and recruitment team, but I've done work at all these departments, and I think each club will be different in terms of where you can find the people who are most willing to work with data, and all of these lead at the end of the day to better first team results. Another thing that I think is really important is to set and share targets. At an analytics department, especially when you're the first hire, you're going to be the only person who actually understands the technical skill sets that you need, how long a project will take. And if you're working with a sporting director, so my boss is the sporting director, who doesn't come from the data world, you have to be really clear about this is what I can accomplish, because it's not going to be clear to them if a project will take 6 months or 2 days. And so I think it's important to say, this is what I want to accomplish, this is how long it will take, and to link that to other departments in the club. I think analytics is one of the only departments that has no real value on its own. The only value that an analytics department provides is how it supports other departments at the club. So whether that's recruitment, first team, I've got an example here of one of the first goals that we had was we want to build a player scouting tool, and that will save us X amount of hours of watching players who we're not going to sign to the club. The next thing I would say is it's important to embed yourself in the process. So again, analytics is only important in how it supports other departments. And I think how you embed yourself in the process depends a lot on the pre-existing processes. So to give an example, at Inter Miami, our head coach is Phil Neville, who came from the England women's setup, and he brought with him his lead analyst, Alex Scott. So they had worked together really closely. They had a clear process in how they worked. So for me, contributing to that process was figuring out, okay, how do I put myself into this process? How do I help them do things that they're already doing? How can I save them time? And that's really about taking a process, not changing what they're doing, but involving yourself in that process and figuring out a spot for yourself. On the recruitment side, it's been much different. So the sporting director, recruitment director, and myself all came in at the same time, all from different clubs. So for us, embedding yourself in the process was actually just creating a process, which is a very different sort of way of approaching things, because I could add in, we have now a 7-step process that every player who comes into our system goes through, and I could add analytics at every layer of that 7-step process. So again, you just have to figure out what are the existing processes, are there existing processes, and if there aren't, how can you create one that analytics has a role in throughout? The next thing I would say is it's important to build tools with users in mind. In my experience, tools are always a better solution than answers. If someone comes to you with a question and you're always providing just an answer, then you're always going to be the one who has ownership over that answer or how data is being used at a club. I find your data is much more likely to be trusted or used in the decision-making process if decision makers actually have ownership over the answers that come from it. And so for that, you need to create tools that people can use rather than just being a request line where you're always providing answers that might be contrary to what someone else thinks. And the key to that is you have to trust people to use data. And if you're trusting people to use data in a club, really your role is as much an educator as it is someone who's actually analyzing the data themselves. So you have to make sure that you're explaining how best use cases with data, allowing people to explore the data themselves, so you're not necessarily the one who's always saying, this is what the data thinks about this player, or this is how I think about this player. Again, I think users coming to answers themselves will always lead to that user or that decision maker in the club having more ownership over that decision. One thing that I've really focused on is building out an analytics infrastructure. As I mentioned, I think you don't want to be just a request line. You're always going to be dealing with requests, and you can't ever stop the fact that people are going to ask you questions using data. But if you build an infrastructure, if you're focused on building tools, it'll make your job easier. So one motto that I've come to is when in doubt, database. If I ever have stopped to think about something that someone's asked for, if I've ever thought, oh, should I database this or should I just answer it right away? If I've ever had that question and decided not to database it, I think I've always regretted it because that same question has come back again. Almost every request that you get at a club, if you do a good job answering it, you're going to get that same request again. So the infrastructure that we have at Inter-Miami, and again, this is just one approach that we've used. There's a bunch of other softwares out there, but we have a PostgreSQL database that's stored on Amazon RDS, and we have a web app that's built in Django and stored in Elastic Beanstalk. If anyone has questions about these softwares, I'm happy to answer them. This has worked really well for us, but I know there's a lot of different approaches that you can do to build out an infrastructure. The other thing that I think is really valuable building out infrastructure rather than just focusing on answering questions is you can find time-saving synergies across departments. So if the performance department is asking for something and you've stored that and you have it in a database, then if the first team head coach asks for something that's related to a question from the performance department, you can help answer that. And I found that's been really helpful in helping work across departments so that everything you do isn't just for recruitment or for first team analysis, but you can actually work across them. I think at a club it's really easy to stop learning. Before coming here to Inter-Miami, I worked at 2 different data companies. And when you're at a data company, you're surrounded by front-end engineers, back-end engineers, data architects, and it's really easy to grow your technical skill set. I had so many people I could learn from, so many people who are more technically skilled than me. Whereas at Inter-Miami, as the only analytics person, I found I kind of have to take the initiative to grow. I have to take the initiative to learn things myself. And a lot of this it's important to communicate that to other people at the club, because if you're working on a project that takes 2 or 3 months and you don't have anything to show for it, someone's going to say, well, what have you been doing for the last 2 to 3 months? So I think if you are going to work on personal development projects, help to grow, you have to tie it to an actual project that will have an end outcome for the club. So, for example, I mentioned earlier that I was working with Django. That was a skill I didn't have before. And I set a target and said, okay, we are going to have a web app that will be ready by this date. And I had worked into that time frame, the time I knew it would take me to kind of learn and get up to speed with, again, this new technology. So I found that's something that's really valuable, is to take the time to make sure you're still learning to grow your technical skill set. On the flip side, I think this is something that Tom mentioned earlier in his talk, but you learn more about football working at a club than you will any other way. I mean, I've learned more about the sport, I think, in the last 2 years than I have in the previous 27 years of my life watching the sport. You're just surrounded by coaches, by video analysts, by people who have a lot of lived experience, and I think it's important to take in as much as you can from that. Just asking questions, sitting in and listening to conversations, not always interjecting when you disagree with something based on the data, but actually taking the time to learn more about the sport. And then one thing that is sort of related to this, which I hadn't considered, and I know this isn't possible at every club, but at a smaller club like we have in MLS, I'm able to watch training whenever I want, and I make an effort to do it at least once a week. I find I learn so much from watching training. One is just figuring out what we're trying to do in a game. So games are messy, tactics aren't necessarily clear. Whereas when you're watching training, it's very clear, okay, once this player moves into this position, this is how another player should respond. And it helps me formulate answers to questions or to formulate things much better when I know what the intended goal of a tactical system is. The other thing is, at the end of the day, if you want to influence how a team plays, the way that'll show up is on the training pitch. So if you see something on the training pitch which isn't necessarily reflected in the game or that you don't see in the data set, that's something where if you want to have an influence in how the team plays, you really have to influence training. It's not your role as a data analyst to ever say we should be doing more or less of this drill. But I think seeing the drills that the coaches are doing with the players and seeing how they're imparting what they want the team to do on the training pitch allows you to better formulate how you present information to the coaching staff and how you might be able to influence their decision-making around how they set up their training sessions. The next thing that I think is so important is making friends in the industry. I have this photo from Jamie Vardy where once, I think it's Schmeichel and Højbjerg here, and he said, ooh, Danish friends. And if you've ever traveled to an away game or had an analytics person come to your club, and you've met the analytics person from another club, you've probably had a similar situation like this where other staff members will make fun of you based on like how much you talk about analytics, because it's like you're with your people. And I think it's so important to have those relationships. Obviously, a day like today is a great day for this, where you're surrounded by people from clubs all over the world with different skill sets. And it's not just about having one or two people that you can rely on, because I think every question that you might have where you need someone else to help you, the types of people you'll need to help answer those questions are different. So at MLS, again, we have a league tracking deal. A lot of resources are centralized within the league. So having people who run analytics departments at different clubs is really important to be able to ask, okay, how big is your department? How have you dealt with this problem from a data provider or whatever it might be? So having people you can ask in the league is really important, but at the same time, I'm not gonna ask someone who's a direct competitor to me questions about more kind of theoretical questions, or questions that are how to deal with certain types of players coming into the league. And another thing, which I probably shouldn't say this too loudly at a data company conference, but sometimes you ask for data from another player that you might not be paying for and might not have, which you shouldn't do too much, but sometimes you need to do it. And having people that you can ask for a data set, whether it's just like a physical data set or a one-off data set on a player, and not be worried about that getting out there. So having people that you can trust and say, oh, we're looking at X player and we'd like some information on this player is really, really valuable. This is something I've definitely used a lot. So I think it really is important, and again, today's a great day to do that, to make sure that you're reaching out to other people, meet people who are dealing with similar problems than you, different problems from you, and just making new friends in the industry. So just to wrap things up, I think it's important to remember that everyone in a club has different goals. So win more games is not necessarily the best guiding principle, because people have different games that they want to win. There's different focuses and goals that people have in a club. So I think building a data culture is a much more valuable way to build out a department, because you have a clearer guiding principle. You can help decision makers do what they know, which games they need to win. They know what their goals are, and it's not necessarily your job as the analytics person to say, this is what we should focus on. So if you empower people to make decisions that help themselves, I think you'll be much more successful. And what that data culture looks like, or what that infrastructure looks like, is going to be different at every single club. So you need to find out what it looks like at your club, and how you can best create that environment which matches the specifics of your club. And then finally, it's important to just personally grow, both within the organization, working with other departments, but also personally, and improve your technical skill set as well as your knowledge and understanding of the sport. So I'm not sure if I have time for questions, but yeah, I want to thank you all for listening to my presentation, and yeah, happy to answer any questions.